I invite you to come with me as we turn back time to the early days of the 19th century. We are going back to a time when life moved at a much slower pace at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. As we slip back, modern conveniences disappear. The airplane, the automobile, and the steam locomotive have yet to be invented. Roads are unpaved country lanes. Trips we measure in minutes and hours now require days and weeks to complete. Near the river we see the rude beginnings of industry. We hear the mill wheels turning and forge hammers beating out their rhythms in iron. Above it all, we hear the sound of nature's abundant energy being turned to man's purpose. Water splashing over the dams, seething through the weirs, roaring down the tail races, driving man's industry in its relentless journey to the sea. And on its waters, we see the boats that are carrying the products of industry to their awaiting markets. For this is Pennsylvania's first great internal highway of commerce, the Schuylkill River. Our journey begins at Tidewater on the Schuylkill near the waterworks. Fairmount, where one day the art museum will rise, is now the city's water reservoir. Here was America's longest single-arch wooden bridge. With a clear span of 340 feet, it was known to Philadelphians as the Colossus. It was built by a German immigrant with no formal training. Louis Wernwag was also the founder of Phoenix Iron Company, which lent its name to the settlement we know as Phoenixville. Wernwag's skill was put to its greatest challenge, though, when he took on the work of taming the river with the others who built the Schuylkill Navigation. The Schuylkill had long been navigated by canoe when the first Europeans settled on its banks, but because of its shallows and treacherous falls, large quantities of goods moved downstream only during brief periods of high water, before the canal was built. The dangers to the boatmen were increased by the numerous fishing weirs that were built in the river to trap the shad during their annual migrations. These hazards were boldly faced by the boatmen who muscled their slender craft through floodwater, loaded to the gunwales with grain and goods. Josiah White, the ingenious Philadelphia Quaker, built a dam in the first operating locks at East Falls, offering safe passage around the obstacle, and proving to the skeptics that the Schuylkill could be tamed for navigation. His pioneering efforts at Falls of the Schuylkill paved the way for a much grander scheme to improve the river all the way to its headwaters, 108 miles inland. This stream, whose early proponent was none other than Benjamin Franklin, was sought by the merchants of Philadelphia who saw the rich interior lands then being settled as a source of future commerce and wealth. A charter was granted by the state legislature in 1815 to incorporate the president, managers, and company of the Schuylkill Navigation, giving them permission to construct a lock navigation from the foot of Callow Hill Street in Philadelphia to the mouth of Mill Creek in present-day Schuylkill County. Work began soon after on what was to become the state's first major engineering work on such a scale to be put into operation. Construction took nearly 10 years, continuing through much adversity. Through floods, epidemics, and short capital, they doggedly persevered until it was accomplished. When it was finished, people gathered at the locks to watch the endless parade of boats locking through with their cargoes, or they boarded packet boats like this to travel upon the canal and see its wonders firsthand. These boats were named Lady of the Lake, Comet, and the Planet, offering trips between Philadelphia and Reading. The fare was advertised at $2.50, including meals. Horse-drawn packet boats clipped along at maximum speeds of 4 to 5 miles an hour, punctuated with stops for lockage. A boat could be put through a lock in 5 to 8 minutes, but delays were a frustration almost from the beginning due to the burgeoning traffic on the canal. It was soon recognized that enlargement of the canal would be necessary. Through the 1830s, locks were doubled and channels deepened to increase carrying capacity of the canal. Anthracite coal was the canal's primary article of trade from the beginning, and tonnage increased dramatically through this period. The Schuylkill's historic waterway was termed a slackwater navigation because about 46 miles of its length were navigated on the river's slackwater pools that were created by a series of dams. The dam pools were connected by canal sections ranging in length from less than a mile to 22 miles. It was a true engineering wonder of the day, and it facilitated rapid economic development all along its length, while the coal carried from the great Schuylkill fields provided fuel for America's industrial revolution. A little-known fact about the Schuylkill: it carried commercial traffic throughout its length, a year before DeWitt Clinton's famed Erie Canal was opened. Coal loaded at Mount Carbon made its way to the Philadelphia market in December of 1824. In a later period, we see two double-header boats rafted in the canal at Manioc. The canal sections, or levels, paralleled the river generally, and were each named. Here we see the Plymouth Canal at Conshohocken, with Plymouth Dam in the background. The Fayette Street Bridge crosses both canal and river. The canal was entered through a guard lock at the dam. Mills and factories located along the canal bank leased water power from the canal company and shipped goods by canal as well, creating a profitable double dip of income and tolls. The Schuylkill Navigation, Pennsylvania's first major canal, came at the beginning of a canal building boom that swept through our young nation like a fever. In a little over 20 years, 4,000 miles of navigable waterways were constructed, much of it through areas that were only sparsely settled. Pennsylvania led all other states with over 1,200 miles, and a lot of it through difficult terrain. The Schuylkill became a link in a great chain of interconnecting waterways that eventually joined the canal systems of New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, Ohio, and beyond. By the 1840s, enlargement of the canal was again necessitated by rapidly increasing demand for anthracite. At this time, a new threat appeared to challenge the canal's monopoly on Schuylkill coal. When the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad extended their line through to Pottsville, the battle was joined. In answer, the Navigation Company began a second major expansion of their works, increasing lock dimensions and canal depths to accept even larger boats. In the early days of the canal, a typical canal boat could carry 50 tons of coal. After the 1846 expansion, burdens were increased to 200 tons. Towpaths were constructed along the canals and slackwater pools to provide a level footing for the primary motive power source, which was, for over 100 years, the mule. Towpaths were usually located on the strip of land between the canal and river. People living along the canal found them to be a handy walkway, and often people would hitch a ride on a passing canal boat to the next lock. Here some locals relax along the towpath in Bridgeport. To overcome a fall of 618 feet from the head of navigation to tidewater, 120 locks were constructed on the original canal, though not all operated as lift locks. Guard locks were kept open like this one in Bridgeport except during periods of high water. After the 1846 enlargement, the number of locks was reduced to 71 by consolidating some of the older locks with their low lifts. This further reduced the time in passage as well, and coupled with the increased size of the boats, vastly enlarged the canal's carrying capacity. Many of the locks were constructed of finely dressed native brown stone set in hydraulic cement. The stone was supplied from quarries along the canal at various places, and the cement was manufactured by the Navigation Company. Other locks were built of dry bed stone and lined with planking. The former were more durable but costly, while the latter cheaper to construct and easier to repair. Here we see some canal features that were ubiquitous. On the right is a wooden towpath walk over a wasteway. This structure allowed the teams of mules and their drivers to cross the overflow. The wasteways were lined with stone to prevent erosion of the bank, and they allowed excess water to flow from the canal back into the river nearby. Sometimes the towpath would shift to the opposite bank along the dam pools, and to carry the teams across, a ferry would be used like this one at Buckwalter's Landing below Royersford. These ferries were connected to overhead cables that were suspended across the river, and the team drivers helped the ferry tender to make the crossing. Later bridges replaced the ferries at most places. Mule galleries were added to the bridges to allow the teams to cross without impeding regular traffic on the bridge. Locks were numbered sequentially from the head of navigation, but were generally known to the boatmen by the lock tender's name or the adjacent landowner's name. Here at Brower's Lock, number 61, below Phoenixville, boats left the slackwater of Pauling's Dam to ascend the Oaks Canal. Both Brower and Pauling were landowners, but the Oaks was canal engineer Thomas Oaks, who built this canal and most of the structures between here and Reading during the initial construction phase of the 1820s. Oaks perished in 1824 along with a large number of his workers of an epidemic. His name was subsequently given to this still existing canal reach to honor his dedicated service. Above the lock we encounter a boat heavily laden with coal bound out of Schuylkill Haven for New York City by way of the canal to Philadelphia, the Delaware River to Bordentown, and the Delaware and Raritan Canal through New Jersey to Raritan Bay. Steam tugs assisted by towing shots of canal boats up the Delaware and again across Raritan Bay to New York. A large number of boats were engaged in hauling through to New York and were equipped with watertight hatches to make them more seaworthy. In the 1850s, boat captains competed for company prize money offered for the fastest round trip. Many trips were completed in less than a week. The competition for prize money was also blamed for the rough-and-tumble tactics employed by the boatmen on the canal. Some of the boatmen were reputed bullies who used intimidation to gain passage through the locks on a priority basis. Many fights occurred on the canal between competing boat crews. Those living along the waterway generally took a dim view of the boatmen, regarding them as brawling rowdies and a class apart, though this characterization was certainly not true in the main. Captain Duffert, seated here on the cabin top of his boat near Reading, looks very relaxed and in a gentle mood. In fact, many families boated on the canal, women and children helping to run the boat, and all living aboard during the season, usually March to December, somehow content in the tiny cabin. Fortunately, there was plenty of deck on these boats, and then close at hand was the tow path. This photo is from the Lehigh Canal, but is a typical scene with a canal wife cooking up a meal on the deck while underway. All along the canal, the lock tenders' families did a lot to supply the boatmen with fresh baked bread, eggs, milk, and produce, which they sold for profit. No boatman could resist the smell of bread baking in the lockhouse kitchen, nor could they miss the chance to get a look and a smile from a pretty lock tender's daughter. After the final enlargement of the canal, boats measured 100 feet in overall length, with a beam of 17.5 feet and a draft of 6 feet when fully loaded. Carrying capacity or burden was in the 180 to 200 ton range for most boats then operating. The maximum burden ever recorded on the Schuylkill Navigation was 213 tons of anthracite carried by the Pilgrim of Schuylkill Haven in 1860. Here we see the Bruce at a later time near the end of her working days. Many boats like this were built in the Warner Yards at Schuylkill Haven, one of the biggest boat yards on the canal. But there were boat building and repair yards at many places along the old canal. On the neighboring Lehigh River, Josiah White, of the Falls of Schuylkill fame, built a competing canal to tap the anthracite trade in this watershed. The plan he developed was a great work with locks even larger than the Schuylkills, as he foresaw the burgeoning coal trade at a very early time. Here boats are being drawn on the Lehigh Canal. The carrying capacity of White's Canal was limited, though, by the small locks built by the state of Pennsylvania on the Delaware Division Canal, through which the Lehigh boats had to pass to reach Philadelphia. Likewise, the water-powered planes on the Morris Canal, which connected the Lehigh with the New York market, were a limiting factor. Here is a unique comparison of the two competitors' boat stock in an old photo taken near the riverfront in Philadelphia. The Lehigh chunkers in the left of center are loaded, while the Schuylkill boat on the right is empty and riding high in the water. The well-worn towpath along the Oaks Canal at Montclair, or Quincyville as it was then known, bears evidence of the heavy usage it received. During the peak tonnage year of 1859, more than 1,400 boats plied the canal, carrying a total of 1.7 million tons of goods, of which 1.4 million tons was anthracite. During this period, Schuylkill Navigation President Frederick Fraley reached an agreement with his old competitor, the Reading Railroad, to apportion coal shipments between the canal and the railroad. Their feuding ended, and a degree of prosperity resulted for both enterprises. Since most of the tonnage hauled on the Schuylkill was coal descending the navigation, boats generally returned light, like these two riding high in the water at Lock 60. A small percentage of the total tonnage was ascending, though, clay for the brickworks, limestone and burnt lime for agriculture, and iron for the foundries were backhauled, which helped to improve the ledger for boat captains. Another view of the lock chamber at Black Rock Dam shows the towpath bridge that allowed teams to cross from the island towpath along the Oaks Canal to the slackwater towpath above the dam. The chamber walls have been given a coat of whitewash to aid the boatmen in night navigation. Boats were also equipped with a coal oil lantern called a night hawker, which was mounted on a post up forward at night to light the towpath bank. The Canal Company operated several steam vessels on the canal for dredging and general repair work. The mud diggers, as they were called by the boatmen, were a necessary item. After 1850, silt from the coal washeries operating upstream began to clog the channels, making navigation difficult. At one time, 5 dredges were operating more or less continuously. As the problem became more acute, the section of canal above Schuylkill Haven had to be abandoned due to siltation. Here we see wreck boat number 2 raising steam. It was employed in various tasks along the canal. One of them was raising sunken canal boats. For this purpose, it was equipped with a diving suit and a large-capacity steam-driven pump to expel water from leaking boats. Navigation had its hazards, including a notorious gang of river pirates known as the Schuylkill Rangers, who preyed on the unwary canalers. Judging by newspaper accounts of their misdeeds, the Rangers specialized in robbing, murdering, and hijacking cargoes. These canoeists near Spring City seem rather carefree, though, as they pose for pictures along the old Vincent Canal. The Rangers grew bolder in crime and eventually proved their undoing when they attempted to hold the town of Schuylkill Haven for ransom one dark night. The town's residents turned out with their own guns and trapped the Rangers on a covered bridge when they attempted to escape. Those who lived through the hail of bullets were brought to quick justice, and the canal was made safe once more for other pursuits, as this caption would indicate on the Vincent Canal. Ice skating was another popular winter pastime along the canal. Boating usually ceased in early December, and when the freeze set in, locals would avail themselves of the smooth ice, often traveling for miles on the canal's frozen surface. Recreational boating, though limited in the early days of the canal due to the heavy commercial traffic, increased rapidly in the latter years when the coal trade began to decline. There were many steam-powered excursion boats operating on the river, carrying people to the popular picnic groves along its banks. An armada of pleasure launches assembles at the Iron Bridge in Spring City. This spot was a popular swimming hole for local boys, the bravest of whom would jump off the top girders of the bridge into the canal. Of course, swimming in the canal was prohibited, but when the officials weren't looking, boys would be boys. Beyond the mill dam, the towpath was a favorite lair of card sharps and lovers. Those wishing to engage in some illicit sport would often find the ideal spot along a lonely stretch of the canal towpath. Above Vincent Dam, canoeists paddle by the Girard Canal outlet lock near Parker Ford. Here is an interesting photo showing the 3 consecutive roads of commerce. To the right is the Schuylkill River, then the Girard Canal and its towpath, and in the foreground is the Pennsylvania Railroad Schuylkill Valley line. All 3 have been abandoned in favor of a 4th line, a concrete highway which lies a few hundred yards to the left of this spot. At Parker Ford, a loaded boat steers for the Pigeon Creek Aqueduct, one of 17 such structures that carry the canal over tributary streams. The aqueduct can be seen ahead of the boat as a narrowing of the canal. This photo was taken from the lower end of Lock 56. A steersman at the tiller, a bowsman to tend the lines, and a driver with his team on the towpath was all the crew needed to move 200 tons of coal to its destination. Motive power was provided by these long-eared hay burners in teams of 3 hitched in tandem. The driver is riding on a shaft mule, though he probably walked more than he rode. A good team of mules was a lot harder to acquire than a driver, and often received better treatment. Drivers, sometimes called hair beaters, were usually young boys who received about $10 a month in exchange for plenty of hard work. Captains would often hold their pay until the end of the boating season to prevent them from jumping the fence. Drivers were expected to turn out their teams brushed and in harness on the towpath at 4 a.m. Teams were sometimes arrayed with brass bells on the hames or studded on the harness. Dyed cowtail plumes in a variety of colors were added to the harness or mounted on the brow band. Here is a team turned out at the company mule sheds in Schuylkill Haven. One observer commented on the fancy harness, said, "When the mules were so dressed up you could forget their pedigrees." These intelligent creatures were much preferred over horses on the canal because they had greater endurance, they ate less, and they wouldn't work themselves to death like a horse. And they were generally smarter around water. When 2 boats passed in the canal, there was always a danger of a tow line being snagged by the passing boat, and the team being pulled into the canal and drowned. It's said that mules could swim out when a horse would founder. Frick's locks, numbers 54 and 55, at the beginning of the 5-mile level, was a double lift chamber, sometimes called a combine lock. The narrow chamber to the right was part of an older twin lock built during the 1830s. After the 1846 enlargement, these older locks were often left in place but were used primarily to control water flowing into the lower level. Wide water on the 5-mile level above Pottstown provided a place where boats could tie up for the night. Such areas were usually provided on either side of a lock and were often several times wider than the canal's minimum design width of 60 feet at the water's surface. As the canal's tonnage declined, night navigation became a thing of the past. Imagine this scene with a score or more of boats rafted up, boatmen and their families on the decks, and all the teams of mules and their drivers on the banks, and you'll be seeing the Schuylkill of the past. Down the towpath a ways, we come to a farm bridge. Every farmer worth his salt whose property was traversed by the canal claimed the lower river fields and insisted the navigation company build him a bridge. Most were of wood on stone foundations, and when they sagged, as wood will do in time, they became a hazard to navigation. So the navigation company had to inspect and repair these bridges and all the other wooden and stone structures along its length continuously. Damaged lock gates had to be replaced immediately. Dams had to be maintained. Each section of the canal had a maintenance scow like this one at Fairmount Dam in Philadelphia. The carpenter gang, turned out in their Sunday best, sits atop their floating workshop and bunkhouse near Reading. Gangs of workmen labored all along the canal and were augmented by the extensive canal shops in Reading, where lock gates were built and wicket gear was cast in their foundry. The canal was a major employer in its heyday. Here we see the magnificent combine locks at Laurel Hill, with a total lift of 24 feet. These massive stone structures with their timber miter gates were well engineered and skillfully built. The combine replaced the original 3-lock staircase that occupied this spot in the 1820s and 1830s. The original locks on the Schuylkill Navigation had an average lift of 8 feet. Improved lock designs increased the average lift to 12 feet after 1846. This reduced the number of locks required to overcome the same fall of 618 feet. Laurel locks, numbers 52 and 53, viewed from above. The rack drives for the wicket gear are visible, which were used to open and close the valves to admit water into the lock chambers or expel it. The gates were opened and closed by a rack drive mechanism powered by the lock tender's arm. It gave him some mechanical advantage, as these gates were so large. Most of the single lift locks had smaller gates that were moved by pushing on the balance beam. Wicket gear was controlled by the lock tender, and at the lock he was king. If unruly boatmen opposed him, he would shut down the lock and no one moved. He controlled the water level below his lock and was responsible for maintaining navigable conditions in it at all hours of the day and night. At Big Reading Dam, seen here, there was a gala party in July of 1824, attended by the governor of Pennsylvania and all of Reading's leading citizens. The president of the Schuylkill Navigation addressed the gathering, numbering in the hundreds. A small fleet of boats waited in the forebay of the lock, decked with bunting, while a band played on the canal banks and cannon were fired. The occasion was the opening of the Girard Canal, the long, hard-fought 22-mile Girard Canal. It was named in this ceremony after the man who financed it and pulled the young navigation company out of the mud, Stephen Girard. So much of the canal was then finished, but for the short section through Reading. This was to be the ultimate test of the young company's skills and perseverance. Vertically oriented limestone beds underlying the newly dug canal provided a conduit for the water when it was let into the canal, and low-lying areas near the canal were inundated. Houses were sunk on their foundations, and a geyser even appeared in a farmer's field. Clay puddling was used to stop the leaks, but problems continued to occur until the company planked all the leaky stretches of the Reading Canal at great expense. By the end of 1825, residents were taking up their stations to observe the mighty works in action. Newspapers faithfully reported the number of boats departing and arriving each day with their cargoes, the comings and goings of packet boats carrying passengers, and noted with great satisfaction the increase in trade. Optimists seemed to rule the day. The works at Reading, which had caused so much trouble, were eventually remedied by digging a new canal right along the river bank and abandoning the old leaky one. The island created by the new canal became the heart of the Schuylkill Navigation's maintenance department, where the shops were located, and out of which a fleet of steam tugs and dredges later operated. People were charmed by the beauty of the newly tamed river. Long placid reaches of still water reflecting tree-lined shores were offset by the rumble of white water plunging over the dams. Poets and painters were inspired. Young lovers sought out its banks, and those who had invested in it grew wealthier. Commerce was stimulated. At first it was a trickle, and then it became a rush as men set out on the towpath to seek their fortunes in the anthracite fields of Schuylkill County. The canal was the artery, the way for men to get rich. But who could deny the simple beauty of the canal flowing peacefully on the shoulder of the river? In a few years it looked like it had always been there. It was man and nature working together to make things better. New forms of recreation evolved to replace the former displays of bravery by the Reading boatmen. Life along the Schuylkill began to assume a different character as the older agrarian society gave way to the thundering industrial giant about to be unleashed by the anthracite floating down on its waters. Above Reading, navigation was on the slackwater pools of a series of river dams, in ascending order: Kissinger's, Shep's, Lize's, and Felix. Each dam had its lock. At Peacock's Lock, numbers 39 and 40, boats entered the Duncan Canal. Rock cuts on the Duncan Canal, named for its builder George Duncan, bear evidence of the laborious hand drilling and black powder blasting necessitated by the steep contour. Another expensive item can be seen along the canal bank, which has been planked to keep the water in the canal. It's hard to imagine the amount of labor involved in building canals in the early 19th century, as it was done with only human and animal power. The same rock cut today is a curious remnant of the Canal Age's engineering accomplishments. Further upstream at Auburn, America's first transportation tunnel was blasted through the rock of a low hill. It carried the bed of the canal 450 feet through the spur, and for years was a major attraction, as people traveled many miles to see boats floating under a hill. The roof was cut out completely in later years. The 10-mile Hamburg Canal began at Leesport and continued through the towns of Shoemakersville, Mooresville, Hamburg, and finally re-entered the river at Kearns Dam. The scene here is the Waterloo Basin above Hamburg, the river and the limb of Blue Mountain off in the distance. Many boats rafted in the Waterloo Basin during the off-season or in periods of slack trade. A change bridge, also called a winding bridge, at the stop gate near Kearns Dam allowed the teams to cross over without unhitching the tow line. The Schuylkill Navigation's highest dam was at Blue Mountain, with an elevation of 30 feet. It was located a short distance below Port Clinton. Like all the other dams on the river, it was built of timber cribbing pinned with iron to the bedrock and filled with stone. The surface of the dam was planked with timber, and sluice gates were installed in the dam which could be drawn to allow maintenance work and flushing out silt from behind the dam. A pair of boats enter Blue Mountain locks, numbers 28 and 29. These particular double boats came off the old Pennsylvania Canal when its main line closed down. Double boats were fastened together and pulled by one team, but could be taken through the locks separately. On deck, the bowsman is snubbing his line on a cleat, while the young boy may be fetching a pail of oats for the mules. The boatman's choice coal stove is smoking away, and breakfast may be in the offing. A long view of the coal loading docks at Port Clinton shows the interface of canal and railroad. The canal was actually linked to early railroad development in the mining region, which served to bring coal from the mines to the canal. In the early days, the coal cars were horse-drawn, but later the first steam locomotives were hauled up to the mine roads by canal boat. In the 1830s, when steam railroading was in its infancy, locomotives were rather crude affairs that often broke down or exploded and received much bad press. They didn't travel much faster than a horse at the trot, and their carrying capacity was very limited. One or two canal boats could carry as much coal as a train of cars, and at less expense. Until the Reading built its line, railroads were used primarily for the short run from mine mouth to canal loading docks. As steam locomotive designs improved, so did their ability to compete with the canal. At Port Clinton, engine number 1204 of the Little Schuylkill and Tamaqua Railroad shifts a string of coal cars on the loading dock. Coal was fed by a chute into the cargo hold. This boat is nearly loaded, as the boatmen are replacing the hatches forward while the aft compartment is finished. Finally, we arrive in Schuylkill Haven in the heart of the anthracite mining region, once a busy port and Queen of the River, as her citizens like to say. The extensive docks at Schuylkill Haven were a scene of intense activity with over a mile of landings served by the mine railroads. Together, these landings were capable of shipping over 1 million tons of coal annually. The banks were lined with boats waiting for orders to load at the docks. Company agents oversaw the activities, and the navigation company had a large brick office building near lock number 12 at the head of the basin, where the division superintendent and the dockmaster worked directing canal operations. The landings worked so efficiently that a boat of the largest class could be completely loaded with 200 tons of coal in about 18 minutes. The canal extended above Schuylkill Haven through Pottsville to the mouth of Mill Creek and was served by the mine roads at various points. There were also iron furnaces along this reach. This engraving shows the Port Carbon landings as they appeared in the 1840s. This upper section of the canal was abandoned by 1872 due to the silt problems created by the coal washeries upstream. By this time also, the canal's old competitor, the Reading Railroad, had acquired control of its works. The disastrous year of 1869 had dealt the navigation company a mortal blow. First, there was a long miners' strike in the coal region that shut down production. Then, a severe drought which caused the flow of water in the river to shrink to the point where the city fathers of Philadelphia closed the locks at Fairmount Dam to conserve water. The rains commenced in September and canal operations resumed. The miners were back at work, and the company hoped to make up for much lost revenue with a strong push until the December freeze. Unfortunately, Mother Nature also tried to make up for the drought. On October 4, 1869, a great flood was visited on the valley of the Schuylkill, one that would be remembered for years to come for its destructiveness. Bridges were torn away, locks were damaged, sections of canal banks disappeared, and even some of the mighty timber crib dams sustained damage. A considerable number of boats were damaged or destroyed. Some torn loose from their moorings were swept over the dams, like this one photographed at Lock 45, Kissinger's Dam, near Reading. Navigation shut down, and the company went to work immediately to repair the damage. Salvage and repair crews were dispatched, and the Reading Railroad, now acting more like a confederate than a competitor, offered assistance. Free railroad passes were issued to the canal workmen, and trains were assembled to carry the timber and other materials where they were needed along the line of works. As it turned out, the winter was mild, and the work progressed at a feverish pace to patch up the dams and rebuild canal banks. Incredibly, by late spring the canal was restored to operation. But the damage done to its financial mechanism by the multiple disasters of 1869 was irreversible. The proud Schuylkill Navigation Company, whose stockholders had once voted to present engraved silver urns to its managers, whose stock had returned 19% dividends in the glory years of the 1830s, one of America's most profitable investments, was bankrupt. A white knight appeared on the scene. His name was Franklin B. Gowan, president of the Reading Railroad. The Reading lacked an all-rail route to New York, while its chief competitors were supplying coal to the city. The canal had a long-established route through the Delaware and Raritan to New York. Gowan saw the unique opportunity to expand his already powerful hold on Schuylkill coal and gain for himself a piece of the New York market. He leased the canal for 999 years and worked out a deal with the stockholders. Under the Reading, coal shipments resumed on the canal. To the boatmen, things didn't seem much different. But inevitably, the railroad began siphoning off the most profitable business for itself, except for the New York shipments, which continued at a high volume. until a competitor secretly bought the Delaware and Raritan Canal. The Pennsylvania Railroad and the Reading were bitter enemies, and now the Pennsy owned the D&R, which was the Reading's water route to New York. For a while, the Pennsy embargoed Schuylkill coal on the D&R, then gave permission to ship over the route, but raised the tolls to exorbitant levels. Finally, the Reading reacted by acquiring a New Jersey railroad that gave them an all-rail route to the city. By the spring of 1888, the people of Schuylkill Haven were preparing for another busy boating season when it was suddenly announced there would be no coal loaded at the docks. A shock of disbelief went through the place. Many thought it was only temporary. So many livings depended on the canal. So many families had boated for a couple generations. The works were in good order. The boats were ready for loading, many with a fresh coat of paint. The mule teams were kicking in their stalls. No one could believe the lock gates had closed forever on the town of Schuylkill Haven, Queen of the River, but they had. Locals ventured out on the placid waters, no longer encumbered by the heavy coal traffic. While coal shipments continued from the docks at Port Clinton, it was a vestigial business. The volume of trade fell to levels not seen since the early days of the 1820s. Then it diminished slowly to a trickle. Still, the lock tenders stood ready to assist boaters through the locks, and they kept their houses and grounds in order. The towpath and canal structures were maintained by the navigation company work gangs as far upriver as Blue Mountain Dam. The canal continued to look much as it did well into the new century. The article which had made the canal great now proved its final undoing. Coal silt made its way further downstream with every high water period, until the channels were too choked to support commercial activity. The last recorded shipment on the canal took place in 1932, and it was a load of paper taken down from Manayunk to Fairmount Dam. The great Schuylkill Navigation was a relic of the past. In the late 1940s, a massive river cleanup was organized to remove the millions of tons of coal silt from the river. A consortium of state and federal governmental agencies went to work to acquire the necessary land for building the impounding basins to contain the silt once it was dredged from the river. The Schuylkill Navigation Company was dissolved in 1949, and all its real estate was conveyed to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Much of the old canal was destroyed in the river cleanup. Dams were removed, locks were gutted of their gates or filled, and towpath bridges were pulled down. For some people it was a very sad thing to see, but here and there a few pieces survived, like this cut stone lock near Parker Ford with its 1835 date stone. The Oaks Canal still flows intact through the town of Montclair, just as it has for 186 years. The local government, recognizing its historic and recreational value, have taken it and made it into a park where people can enjoy its placid beauty. A section of the canal at Manayunk is also maintained and cherished by the local community, where it helped galvanize the revitalization of the town's waterfront business district. In the village of Gibraltar, the Stone Arch Aqueduct over Allegheny Creek was preserved by the county, with much support from the local community and help from the Schuylkill River Greenway Association. Once in danger of collapse, the aqueduct was stabilized and rehabilitated and is now the centerpiece of a small county park. It is a suitable monument to the energy, vision, and skill of a former age. Most of the canal remnants can be found in the wild river margins, abandoned to nature and largely forgotten, like here at Towers Lock near Vincent Dam. These pieces of the old waterway lie hidden, and like buried treasure, they invite you to find them, to admire the stonemason's skill, and wonder at how the progress of an age could be so quickly swallowed up. They furrow your brow with questions and inspire awe at their dimensions. What an amazing piece of work this was in its time. Beside these remnants, the Schuylkill Navigation exists today only as printed words and memories in the minds of our elder citizens who remember the canal. Hazy childhood memories, perhaps, of swimming in the loch so long ago, or of a story told about an ancestor who once piloted a boat or drove a team, or tended a lock on the Schuylkill Canal. Today, shiny black mules in bell-studded harness no longer strain at the tow rope, and barefoot boys don't walk the tow path behind them. Hard-muscled boatmen don't blow the horn to warn the lock tender, and water doesn't rush through the wickets in answer. Their way of life has vanished beneath the tide of time. Only their fading and distant echoes are heard in the valley of the Schuylkill.